With hands that mangled, it's a miracle she can even salute. The young cadet's voice was sharp with arrogance. He smirked, waiting for a reaction. But the instructor's silence was more unnerving than any retort he could imagine. The place they called the Crucible hummed with the sound of quiet ambition. It wasn't a battlefield of mud and steel, but of polished chrome and cobalt blue light. Here, at Vandenberg Space Force Base, the future of aerospace warfare was forged. Cavernous hangars housed simulators that could replicate the crushing G-force of a suborbital dogfight or the profound silence of a spacewalk. Data streamed across vast holographic displays, a constant river of telemetry, threat assessments, and mission parameters. Everything was sterile, precise, and perfect. Everything except for Captain Maya Vance's hands. She stood before the hulking Atlas 7 simulator, a machine capable of recreating any known atmospheric or zero-gravity condition. To the cadets who gossiped in the mess hall, she was an enigma, a relic from a bygone era of piloting, her methods too cautious, her demeanor too remote. She wore the standard charcoal gray instructor's jumpsuit, a stark, functional garment that seemed to absorb the light around her. While the cadets buzzed with nervous energy, Maya possessed a stillness that was almost absolute. Her focus was on a holographic interface hovering beside the simulator's hatch. Her fingers, a tapestry of silvered, keloid-scarred skin, moved with an impossible, delicate precision. The ridges of scar tissue, ghosts of a fire that had tried to claim her, traced intricate patterns as she swiped through diagnostic screens. Where her skin was smooth, it was unnaturally pale. Where it was puckered, it seemed to catch the hangar's cold light and hold it captive. From across the hangar, Cadet Jake Riley watched her, a smirk playing on his lips. He was everything Maya wasn't, loud, brash, and dripping with the unearned confidence of natural talent. He was Ace, a call sign he'd given himself and that his small circle of admirers used without a trace of irony. He was handsome in a sharp, angular way, and he moved with the swagger of someone who had never truly failed at anything. "Look at her," Jake murmured to his friend, Liam. "Still running manual calibrations. The AI can optimize G-force protocols in under a second. It's like watching someone insist on using a slide rule when they have a quantum computer in their pocket." Liam chuckled nervously. "Give her a break, Ace. She's old school." "She's a liability," Jake countered, his voice rising just enough to carry. He and his clique sauntered over, their crisp black cadet uniforms a stark contrast to Maya's worn gray. They stopped near the Atlas 7, surrounding her workspace. Jake leaned against the machine's chassis, feigning a casual interest. "Everything running smoothly, Captain?" he asked, his eyes pointedly dropping to her hands as they hovered over the glowing console. It was the first time he'd seen them up close, and his feigned casualness curdled into a flicker of genuine revulsion. "Whoa. Rough landing sometime in your past?" The question hung in the air, thick and poisoned. The other cadets shifted uncomfortably. It was framed as an innocent query, but the tone was pure mockery, a deliberate jab at her most visible vulnerability. Maya didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the screen, her expression unreadable. The final line of code she was adjusting snapped into place. A pleasant chime echoed softly as the diagnostic display switched from amber to a solid, reassuring green. Only then did she retract her hands, balling them into loose fists at her sides. She turned her head slowly, and for the first time, her eyes met his. They were the color of a storm-tossed sea, deep and turbulent. There was no anger in them, no defensiveness, just a profound, unnerving weight. "The machine is only as reliable as its user, Cadet Riley," she said, her voice low and steady, yet it cut through the hangar's hum like a laser. "It's ready for you." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Her footsteps were measured, silent on the polished concrete floor, leaving Jake standing in a bubble of silence. He had expected a reaction, a flash of anger, a stammered defense, anything to confirm his perceived superiority. Instead, he got nothing. He had been assessed, dismissed, and ignored. For a man who lived on attention, it was a greater insult than any verbal comeback. He watched her retreating back, and the smirk on his face tightened into a hard, resentful line. He felt a prickle of fury. He would make her see him. He would make her react. A younger cadet, watching from a distance, shivered. He hadn't seen an instructor dismiss the class ace so completely. He'd also noticed something Jake had missed, the way Captain Vance's scarred fingers had moved over the holographic controls. It wasn't clumsy or slow. It was a dance of profound intimacy, the movements of someone who didn't just operate the machine, but understood its very soul. The flashback didn't arrive with a gentle fade. It crashed into her consciousness, triggered by the sterile quiet of her Spartan quarters. She was sitting on the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands under the cold, white light of a desk lamp. The ridges and valleys of scarred tissue were a map of a single, defining moment. She flexed her fingers, the skin pulling taut, and the memory roared to life, not as a dream, but as a visceral, sensory assault. Alarms. A deafening, metallic scream of tearing metal that vibrated through her bones. The SSV Horizon, a jewel of orbital engineering, was dying around her. One moment, she had been monitoring the station's long-range sensors, the next, the universe had dissolved into chaos. A cascade failure in the fusion core. A series of explosions had ripped through the station's spine, turning corridors into vacuum-filled tombs and habitable modules into spinning coffins. The feeling of stable, artificial gravity vanished, replaced by a violent, nauseating tumble as their section of the station broke free. She wasn't alone. Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant civilian astrophysicist with kind eyes and a picture of his 2 kids taped to his console, was strapped into the seat beside her in the emergency escape pod. He'd never been trained for this. His face was a mask of sheer terror, his breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. I can't, he gasped, his eyes wide and unfocused. Eris. Maya's voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through his panic. Breathe. Look at me. Eris. The pod's automated systems were dead. Red lights blinked across the board like malevolent eyes. The main screen read, autopilot offline. Manual engagement required. A death sentence. No one had successfully performed a manual atmospheric re-entry in a pod this damaged in 70 years. It's over, Eris whispered, his body going limp with despair. We're dead. Not yet, Maya gritted out. She tore at the fused panel covering the manual flight controls. The metal was hot, and it sliced her fingertips, but she barely noticed. With a final, desperate wrench, the panel came free. And she saw why the system had failed. A power surge had melted the control interface. The joystick and throttle levers weren't just hot, they were glowing a dull, menacing cherry red, raw energy arcing between exposed circuits. There was no time for emergency gloves, no time for anything but action. She took a breath, the recycled air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation. And then she reached forward. The pain was immediate, white-hot and blinding. A scream caught in her throat, but she choked it down. The smell of her own flesh searing filled the tiny cabin. She forced her mind past the agony, focusing on the attitude indicator spinning wildly on the secondary display. Her world narrowed to a single point of data, their angle of approach was too steep. They were coming in like a meteor, not a vessel. They would be incinerated in seconds. Eris, she yelled, her voice strained. The telemetry data. Read it to me. Now. Her command jolted him from his terror. He fumbled with his console, his voice trembling as he began calling out numbers. Angle minus 17 degrees. Velocity 12,000 meters per second. With her right hand fused to the joystick and her left on the throttle, she fought the dying machine. Every correction sent a new wave of fire up her arms. She could feel the skin blistering, splitting. Through the viewport, the Earth was no longer a beautiful blue marble, it was a terrifying, spinning wall of fire as the pod's heat shield began to glow. It's not working. Eris cried out as a violent shudder racked the pod. Hold on. Maya roared. She saw the flaw in the standard re-entry model. It was designed for a stable craft. Theirs was a tumbling brick. She had to do something radical. She pulled back on the stick, an agonizing, deliberate motion, forcing the pod into a counterintuitive skip glide. A maneuver that existed only in theory, one that would put unimaginable stress on the already compromised hull. The pod screamed in protest. For a terrifying second, it felt like they were being torn apart. Eris was reciting the names of his children now, a desperate prayer. Chloe. Leo. Then, a change. The violent shuddering lessened, replaced by a steady, powerful vibration. The angle of entry stabilized. They were through the worst of it. They were going to make it. The adrenaline began to fade, and the pain, which had been a roaring inferno, became a universe of pure agony. Maya slumped back against her seat, her vision tunneling to black. The last thing she saw was Eris staring at her hands, still fused to the controls, his face a mixture of horror, gratitude, and awe. She awoke in a sterile medbay, the scent of antiseptic a welcome replacement for burnt wiring. Colonel Eva Rostova, a major at the time, was sitting by her bed, her expression grim but respectful. "You saved him, Captain," Rostova said, her voice low. "The board is calling it a miracle. The Phoenix maneuver, they're calling it." Maya tried to speak, but her throat was raw. She lifted her arms. They were encased in white bandages, thick and sterile. She couldn't feel her fingers. She closed her eyes, but the image of the glowing controls was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. She had survived. But the fire from the horizon had come home with her. Back in the present, the tension in the crucible was a palpable thing. Jake Riley's resentment, left to fester after his public dismissal by Maya, had sharpened into a kind of targeted disdain. He began a quiet campaign of microaggressions, each one designed to chip away at her authority. In the mess hall, he would loudly recount tales of legendary pilots, always concluding with a pointed comment about how the greats never let themselves get injured. During physics lectures, he would ask overly complex questions, not for clarification, but in an attempt to trip her up. Maya, for her part, seemed oblivious, meeting his passive aggression with the same unnerving calm. Her professional focus was absolute, which only served to fuel Jake's frustration. The stage was set for a more dramatic confrontation. It came during the final exam for the advanced simulation course, the infamous Star Intercept scenario. It was a notoriously brutal test, designed to push a pilot's cognitive and strategic limits by throwing a dozen unpredictable variables at them. The entire class was gathered in the main simulation amphitheater. A massive, 360-degree holographic display filled the center of the room, while cadets occupied individual simulator pods ringing its periphery. High above, in the darkened observation deck, Colonel Eva Rostova watched, her presence unannounced. Jake was first. As ace, he had insisted on it. He strode to his pod with his signature swagger, throwing a confident wink to his friends. The simulation began. The holographic display flared to life, showing Jake's Viper-class interceptor against a backdrop of a swirling asteroid field. For the first few minutes, he was flawless. He dodged asteroids with arrogant ease, his movements aggressive and precise, a perfect execution of textbook maneuvers. He was showing off. Then, the scenario threw its first curveball. A simulated solar flare erupted, overloading his primary sensors with a wave of static. The textbook response was to fall back and reboot. But Jake, ever the aggressor, pushed forward, switching to secondary sensors. It was a fatal mistake. The scenario was designed to punish it. The secondary sensors couldn't filter out the ghost signals created by the flare. He mistook an asteroid's shadow for an enemy vessel, firing his plasma cannons into empty space. While his systems were on a micro-recharge cycle, the real enemy ship, which had been hiding in the flare's energy signature, emerged and scored a direct hit. The amphitheater was filled with the blaring sound of a failed mission. The words "mission failed" glowed in stark, unforgiving red above Jake's pod. He emerged, his face flushed with anger. He tore his helmet off, his knuckles white. "It's the simulator," he announced to the room, his voice tight with fury. "There's a lag in the haptic feedback, I felt it. And the sensor data from the flare was corrupted. It's impossible." He looked directly at Maya, who stood by the master control panel. "Maybe the older simulators can't handle the new scenarios, Captain." The accusation was clear. He wasn't just making an excuse, he was blaming her equipment, and by extension, her. A heavy silence fell over the room. Maya didn't argue. She didn't defend the machine. Instead, she did something no one expected. With a few keystrokes on the console, she reset the scenario. Then, she walked with quiet purpose to the now vacant simulator pod. "Open Pod 7, she commanded the room's AI. A murmur went through the cadets. Instructors rarely, if ever, ran scenarios in front of their students. It was an unwritten rule. She slid into the seat, her movements economical and smooth. The canopy hissed shut. The main display flickered, and once again, the asteroid field materialized. The simulation began. Her approach was immediately different from Jake's. It was less aggressive, more fluid. She was a dancer, not a brawler, her ship weaving through the debris with an almost supernatural grace. When the solar flare erupted, she didn't fight it. She didn't fall back. She did something no one had ever seen. She executed the Phoenix maneuver. She cut her primary engines, momentarily silencing her own energy signature, and used the gravitational pull of a large asteroid to slingshot herself through the flare's interference zone. For a terrifying 2 seconds, her ship was a dead piece of metal, completely invisible and vulnerable. Then, on the other side, her engines flared back to life, and she was perfectly positioned behind the enemy vessel. The kill was clean, efficient, and breathtakingly elegant. "Mission complete" shown in brilliant, triumphant green. The pod opened. Maya stepped out, her expression as placid as ever. The amphitheater was utterly silent, the only sound the soft hum of the cooling systems. She walked over to the still fuming Jake. She stopped in front of him, her stormy eyes locking onto his. "The machine works, Cadet," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of an iron gavel. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Jake. He had been beaten. He had been proven wrong. And it had been done in front of everyone, by the very woman he had dismissed as a broken relic. The fuse of his pride, already short, had just been lit by a blowtorch. The air in the debriefing room was thick enough to choke on. The data from Maya's flawless simulation run was displayed on the main screen, a silent testament to Jake's failure. Cadets sat stiffly in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with Jake, whose face was a thunderous mask of resentment. Maya stood at the front of the room, calmly dissecting the 2 runs. She used a laser pointer to highlight Jake's critical error on the holographic replay. Cadet Riley's mistake was not tactical, but philosophical, she explained, her tone academic and detached. He relied on the aggressive protocols he had mastered, failing to adapt when the scenario presented an unknown variable. He fought the storm. You must learn to fly with it. Her critique was professional, precise, and utterly impersonal. And for Jake, that was the final insult. He wasn't just wrong, he was an object lesson. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping backwards with a screech that made everyone flinch. Philosophical, he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and wounded pride. This is about skill. About having what it takes. His eyes, wild and furious, fell on her hands, which were resting on the console. And he lost control. "And what do you know about it?" he snarled, his voice rising to a shout. "What can you teach us?" How to hold a joystick with hands like that? He flung his own hand out, pointing an accusing finger at her scars. A captain who can barely grip a control stick. Are you serious? Or is the whole point of your being here just to get sympathy for those scars? A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. This was no longer about pride or competition. It was a vicious, personal attack. Even Jake's own friends looked at him with shock. Into this toxic, frozen silence, a side door clicked open. Colonel Eva Rostova stepped into the room. She must have been in the adjoining observation suite the entire time. She moved with a liquid grace that belied the iron authority she radiated. Her boots made no sound on the floor, but her presence landed with the force of a shockwave. The cadets instinctively straightened, their eyes locked forward. Rostova's gaze, as cold and clear as ice, swept across the room before settling on Jake. He visibly deflated, the color draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of his insubordination. You have a question about Captain Vance's qualifications, Cadet Riley? Rostova's voice was deceptively soft, yet it carried an edge that could strip paint from steel. No, Colonel, Jake stammered, his arrogance vanishing in a puff of terror. I misspoke. It was out of line. Rostova ignored him as if he were a piece of furniture. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the main console where Maya stood, still and silent. The colonel's eyes briefly met Maya's, and in that fleeting glance, an entire history of shared conflict and hard-won respect passed between them. Rostova stopped beside the console. She reached out one finger and tapped a key. The simulation data on the main screen vanished. It was replaced by a single, stark file header, projected 10 feet high for all to see. SSV Horizon, After Action Report, Level 10 Classified. Beneath it, a single line of text was automatically highlighted, as if summoned by a ghost in the machine. Lead Operator, Escape Pod 7, Captain Maya Vance. Assigned call sign, Phoenix. The name hung in the air. Phoenix. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. A ghost story whispered by grizzled veterans and wide-eyed recruits alike. Phoenix was the pilot who had manually flown a crippled escape pod through an impossible re-entry. Phoenix was the one who had survived the fire that consumed the horizon. Phoenix was the hero whose name was in all the confidential reports, but whose face was unknown. Phoenix was the reason Dr. Eris Thorne and his 2 children still had a father. Jake Riley stared at the screen, his mouth agape. His mind frantically connected the dots. The legend. The instructor. The simulator. The scars. Oh God. The scars. They weren't a mark of failure. They were the price of a miracle. They were the receipt for a life saved, paid with her own flesh. Colonel Rostova let the silence stretch, twisting the knife of understanding in every cadet's gut. Then, she turned her head slightly toward Maya, her voice ringing with formal, undeniable authority. Captain Vance, she commanded. The class seems to be struggling with unconventional problem-solving. At your earliest convenience, I want you to draft a new training module. Show these cadets the standard emergency protocol for the Phoenix maneuver you developed during your debrief. The final word landed like a hammer blow. Her call sign wasn't just a name. It was now an official, named maneuver. A part of the very curriculum they struggled to master. The scene ended on Jake's face. It was a mask of shattered pride, of dawning horror, and of a shame so profound it seemed to physically crush him. He looked from the glowing screen to Maya's mangled hands and understood that he hadn't just they held the deep, weary sorrow of someone who had paid an impossible price. You were right about one thing, she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. I can't always hold a coffee cup steady without thinking about it. My grip isn't what it used to be. She looked down at her own hands, then back up at him. But when it mattered, my hands held. The simple, profound truth of that statement struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. Tears welled in his eyes, tears of shame and a dawning, painful understanding. "I only saw the scars," he whispered, the words a confession. "That's all I saw." A flicker of something, not forgiveness, but perhaps acceptance, softened Maya's gaze. "Most people only see the skin," she replied. "It's the easiest thing to judge." She took a step closer. "What matters, cadet, is that now, you're choosing to look for the story underneath." That single sentence offered him not an absolution, but a path. A chance not to be forgiven, but to become better. He stood there in the starlight, his world shattered and remade, finally understanding that the true measure of a pilot wasn't in their flawless record, but in how they flew through the fire. In the weeks that followed, the culture of the entire class began to shift. The change started with Jake Riley. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. He no longer sat at the front of the class, vying for attention, but chose a seat in the middle, and he didn't just listen, he heard. He filled notebooks with meticulous notes. His questions in class were no longer designed to challenge, but to understand. The ripple effect was undeniable. During a complex lecture on orbital mechanics, when a newer, cocky cadet from another class questioned one of Maya's theories on gravitational slingshots, it was Jake who stood up. "With all due respect, sir," he said, addressing the new cadet, "Captain Vance's model is sound. It accounts for microgravitational distortions, a principle proven during the successful re-entry of the Horizon pod." He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who hadn't just learned the material, but had studied its life-or-death application. The room fell silent. No one questioned Maya again. The other cadets followed Jake's lead. The cutthroat competition for the top spot eased, replaced by a sense of collaborative respect. They started holding late-night study sessions, with the stronger cadets helping those who struggled. They began to understand what Maya had been trying to teach them all along, that a pilot alone is vulnerable, but a squadron that trusts each other is unbreakable. They spoke of her among themselves, always with a new reverence. They called her Phoenix, but never to her face. It was a name reserved for legend, and she was living it. Jake sought out extra sessions with her, but not for flashy maneuvers. He asked about emergency ethics. About command decisions under extreme duress. About the psychology of fear. He was no longer trying to be an ace. He was trying to be a leader. Months later, the announcement came. Captain Maya Phoenix Vance was being promoted to major and reassigned to command headquarters. Her new role, to redesign the entire Space Force training curriculum from the ground up, based on her proven, unconventional methodologies. On her last day, she walked across the main hangar bay to say a final goodbye to Colonel Rostova. The cavernous space was filled with the usual hum of activity, cadets performing pre-flight checks and running diagnostics. Then, one cadet saw her. He stopped what he was doing and stood at attention. Another followed suit. Then another, and another. Led by Jake Riley, the work in the hangar ceased. In a wave of spontaneous, unspoken consensus, the cadets moved. They formed two perfect ranks, creating a silent, solemn corridor for her to pass through. As Maya walked down the center of the path they had made for her, no one spoke. No orders were given. There were no cheers, no applause. There was only a profound, powerful silence. As she passed each cadet, they raised their hand to their brow in a slow, deliberate, perfect salute. It was the ultimate gesture of respect in their world. A silent, uniform acknowledgement of a warrior, a hero, and a teacher. Maya paused at the end of the corridor. She looked down the two lines of solemn, upturned faces, her gaze finally resting on Jake. His eyes were clear and steady, filled with a respect that was hard-earned and absolute. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of his journey, and of hers. Then she turned and walked away, her form silhouetted against the bright light of the open hangar door. Heroes aren't forged in victory parades or immortalized by the medals on their chests. They are forged in the quiet, desperate moments of impossible choice. Their monuments are not made of stone, but are carried in the memories of those they saved, and sometimes, etched into their own skin. True strength isn't about having no scars. It's about knowing what they cost, and bearing them with honor. True heroes often carry invisible medals. In the comments below, we'd be honored if you shared a story about a quiet hero you know, someone whose strength isn't loud, but deep. Please, comment with respect for every story shared. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.